The strong performance of the Cambodian opposition in the 2013 elections and subsequent call for leadership change surprised many observers. Nevertheless, the Cambodian People's Party continued to rule, and Mr. Hun Sen recently marked 30 years in power. With me here is Sebastian Strangio, a former reporter for the Phnom Penh Post and author of Hun Sen's Cambodia, a book about Mr. Hun Sen's three-decade rule, to talk more about what we might expect in Cambodia's future political development. Thank you for joining us, Sebastian.
Thanks for having me.
So you moved to Cambodia in 2008, the year there was an election that is arguably the height of the popularity of Mr. Hun Sen and the ruling party. Did the results in the elections 5 years after, in 2013, surprised you?
They did, yeah. I think there were very few people who guessed what was going to happen. 2008 was an overwhelming victory for the CPP, and it seemed as if they had established their dominance to such an extent that it was now beyond challenge. But what 2013 showed is that we were mistaken about a lot of the, or we'd overlooked many of the social and economic changes that had taken place over the, not only over the past 5 years, but over the past 2 decades.
You know, also after the election, the ruling party promised deep reforms. To what extent do you think they can deliver that promise?
Well, it's always going to be a challenge for them. I think that Hun Sen realizes the importance of reform, and that if he doesn't take steps to improve things for ordinary people, that the party is going to have a very difficult time being re-elected in 2018. And so you can already see that they've started taking steps in education, in environmental policy. But the problem with the Cambodian political system is that, you know, Hun Sen relies so heavily on a class of tycoons and business people and powerful military commanders and government officials. And his rule has been based on keeping these people happy. Now, the $60,000 question is whether he'll be able to reform the system enough to keep people from switching their vote to the opposition, while still maintaining the power and support of these individuals who have supported his rule for so long.
What is your sense of that?
Well, so far, things have, you know, the contradiction remains. I mean, the government has taken some positive steps, reforming education, for instance, but when it comes to challenging the entrenched economic interests that exist in Cambodia, the powerful tycoons, and their connection to things like logging and deforestation, land grabs. That link has been very difficult to sever. There's still an incredible inertia out in the provinces. And so, you know, the logging continues, land grabs continue. And I think that the government actually has only a limited amount of power to really stop it. They rely, you know, the system relies too heavily on this. So only time will tell whether they're ultimately successful in getting that balance right.
I guess part of the question is also rests on the opposition, which also has been criticized for lack of leadership. I think you mentioned somewhat in the book as well about the opposition. Now, do you see the opposition as a viable alternative in next election? And also, what more should they do to actually live up to some of the promises they hold?
Well, it's very difficult for the opposition because, you know, in a political system that's based on patronage, which is the way Cambodia works today, you know, and bonds of loyalty between ministers and their staff and military commanders and the soldiers that serve them, it's very difficult for the opposition simply to slot in into that system and command the loyalty of all of these civil servants and soldiers and police officials. And so in that sense, I think they face huge challenge. And I think the best thing the party can do at the moment is to work away slowly at you know, promoting better policies and pushing their agenda in Parliament, and then, you know, hope that slow incremental change allows them more and more say in how the country is governed. I don't think a rapid transition of power is likely in Cambodia, and in the past, most transitions of power from one group to another have involved some sort of violence, and so I think slow slow sort of evolution is probably the best course. But I don't think the party is in a position to immediately take control of the country. Nor do I think Hun Sen is in a position or of an inclination to grant them that.
In your book, you seemed optimistic about Cambodia's future younger generation. An analyst mentioned that the future of Cambodia rests on that generation's ability to produce its own leaders to avoid what he called old politics. How and when do you think that might happen?
Well, I think it's already starting to happen. There are a lot of young, the Cambodian population now is more educated and more connected to the outside world than ever before. And so I think that we're already starting to see young people rise up, either in the NGO sector or the private sector, who have incredible leadership abilities. The question is whether the current political system will allow them to, use their talents in government. And, so far, the 18 months since the election has pretty much been politics as usual. It's been old politics. It's been, negotiations between key individuals and a lot of egos and, not a lot of substance.
It's generally understood that Mr. Hun Sen is grooming his children for future transitions. What would be the consequence of that?
Well, it's too soon to say, I think, exactly what the CPP is planning. They're certainly planning some sort of generational succession. You see that with not just Hun Sen's children, but also many other ruling party officials have maneuvered their sons and daughters into positions of power. But as with everything in the CPP, it depends not just on what Hun Sen wants, but also what all of the powerful people that have a stake in the current system, what they want. And I think that any potential candidate to take over from Hun Sen will have to have the loyalty of the majority of the country's power brokers. And I think it's too soon to say who might be in a position to command that sort of loyalty.
I have a last question. You mentioned in your book that the Cambodian story needs to be told. What do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned from Cambodia that can be applied in the region, Southeast Asia?
Well, I think it's the fate of Cambodia's democratic transition. In places like Myanmar right now, we see a similar sort of transition happening, a move from a closed, isolated and embargoed system to one that's welcoming international aid and foreign investment. But I think what Cambodia shows is that the ability to engineer democracy in a country that has such a violent and unstable history and very little history of democratic government was always going to be a tall order. And I think it is a cautionary tale for the ease with which these sorts of systems can be simply built from the ground up. But the problem is that very few people, pay attention to Cambodia anymore, and it's a pity because I think these lessons are, are very clear. And I think if people looked at Cambodia and analyzed what's gone on in the last 20 years since the UNTAC mission of the early 1990s, I think they would have much more tempered expectations about the democratic possibilities for somewhere like Burma.
Well, because of time, we have to end here, but thank you so much, Sebastian, for talking to VOA.
Of course, thank you for having me.